Question: what has to happen in order for a seller to be able to keep a buyer's deposit during a real estate transaction? Hey everyone, it's Craig with Aviara Real Estate, your Conejo Valley real estate expert. And that's a question I get all the time from my sellers is, if the buyer isn't performing and they missed a deadline, do I get to keep their deposit? And so let me break that down a little bit for you to start with. The good faith deposit is generally left by a buyer and deposited into escrow when they first open the transaction and come to agreement. It's usually 3% of the purchase price. So during that time, the buyer has these certain time periods that they have to meet their contingency deadlines. There's generally 17 days for their inspections and another 21 days for the appraisal and the loan contingencies to come through. And after that time period, the buyer is supposed to, or whatever the agreed upon time period is, usually the buyer has to remove their contingencies. Once that is done, the buyer is kind of locked into the transaction, and should the buyer default and back out at that point, then the seller is entitled to some, if not all, of the buyer's deposit. And so some of the confusing things that I get from sellers all the time is when a buyer goes along and the contingency period that's agreed to comes and goes, is the seller automatically entitled to that? And the answer is no, and the reason is this. The real estate purchase contract, the contingencies are what's called an active contingency as opposed to a passive contingency. If it was a passive contingency, the timeline would come and go and the contingency would automatically be removed. That's not the case with this. It's an active contingency, which means when that time period comes, the buyer has to physically remove in writing that contingency before we can move on and a situation could occur where a buyer would be in default. There are many reasons why they don't. Either they're continuing to do inspections, there's timeline, there's questions that still need to be answered. You can get extensions on that, but that's the reason it's flexible, because there's things that go on during the transaction that require it to be a little bit. Now, if a buyer is being stubborn and they're not removing their contingencies, the seller has an option to give the buyer, which is called the notice to perform, which gives the buyer a specific amount of time to be able to either remove that contingency or cancel the transaction. If the buyer chooses to do neither, then at that point the seller can cancel the transaction, but the buyer is still entitled to that full deposit back. So it's super frustrating for a seller when that situation occurs where the buyer's not removing their contingencies for whatever reason and the seller wants them to so they can feel comfortable, they're locked in. It's definitely a negotiation and a management that takes place, a professional to be able to go through it and kind of get all the sides to come together and agree so that everyone can move forward. So it's definitely a delicate process and it can be very confusing, which is why you need a real estate professional to help you through the transaction. So if you guys have any questions about good faith deposit, contingency timelines, or anything else that goes in through the real estate transaction, please feel free to let me know. I'm happy to help however I can with whatever you guys might need. And remember, who you work with matters and experience counts. So keep that in mind when hiring and referring your next realtor. Thanks everyone. I'll talk to you soon.